Forcing myself to stop. Just one of my favorite songs in the world. That's Baruch Chait's Pisku Li, sung by Moshe Storch during Hallel back at Sukkot. But we're saying Hallel every day now during Hanukkah. How's everybody doing? Thanks for tuning in an hour early. Special time today and tomorrow. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house an hour early on a Wednesday? Stephen in New Hampshire, Ryan in Florida, Bella in Florida, Yitzhak in Minnesota, Shandora in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Joseph in Massachusetts, Guy in Ohio, Karen in Northern California, Joe in the Inland Empire, Tom in PA, Aoife in Florida, Marjorie says shalom, and Frank in San Pedro. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily sponsored by Judith Cohen for the healing of Marcus R. May Marcus have a complete and speedy recovery. We say amen. And Judith, thank you so much for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. May you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And we say amen. Good. I only had one, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was one too many. It's Hanukkah. It's donut time. I had a Krispy Kreme. We have a kosher Krispy Kreme, not too far away. Very delicious, but maybe not the best thing for me. Okay, let's do it. It's a relatively short daf tonight, but with some very important issues. Mishna number 5, here in chapter 4 of Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. We are on page 41a near the top. Mishnah number 5, with regard to an ox that gored a person and the person died. If the ox was forewarned, a muad ox, its owner pays the ransom, as we were discussing the ransom, the kofer, meaning that he owes money according to his own valuation, not the valuation of the person who died. This is in addition to the damages that are owed to the family of the person who died. And this is as an atonement, right? That's what we were talking about yesterday. But if the ox was innocuous, a tom, no history of goring, he is exempt. The owner is exempt from paying the ransom. And both this forewarned ox and that innocuous ox are liable to be put to death for killing a person. And the same law applies in a case where the animal killed a boy. And the same applies in the case where it killed a girl. If the ox gored and killed a Canaanite slave or a Canaanite maidservant, its owner gives the victim's master 30 sela, whether he was a slave worth 100 maneh, meaning 100 silver dinars, or if the slave was worth only 1 dinar, the fine paid is the same, and that's because that fine is stipulated in the written Torah. That's Mishnah number 5. The Gemara asks, but since we kill the ox for killing a person, when it is still considered innocuous, how can you find the case of a forewarned ox killing a person? So what they're saying is forewarned with respect to what, right? We learned several pages ago that if an ox is forewarned with respect to goring Camels, it is not forewarned with respect to goring other oxen, right? And if it's forewarned with respect to oxen, it's not necessarily forewarned with respect to goring people. So here they're saying, well, if you're saying that it's forewarned, does that mean that it killed 3 people? And that's why it's considered a forewarned ox when it kills the 4th person? But that would never happen, because obviously as soon as an ox kills a person, even if it's the first time, we put down the ox. So how can you find a forewarned ox with respect to killing people? And Rabbah said, here we are dealing with a case where in 3 instances of attacking people, the court assessed that had the people not escaped, the ox would certainly have killed them. Therefore, despite the fact that the ox didn't kill anyone, it now has the status of a forewarned ox. It endangered people on 3 occasions. Rav Ashi said, such an assessment is not worth anything. Since the ox did not actually kill them, it is not rendered forewarned, even if it intended to kill. Rather, here we are dealing with a case where it endangered the lives of 3 people by goring them, and they all died only after the 3rd goring, right? The first 2 were injured and succumbed to their wound later. Therefore, the ox had not been put to death because it had not killed a person. Rav Zevid said, no. The Mishnah is discussing a case where it killed 3 animals, which is sufficient to render the ox forewarned, but for which it is not put to death. And the Gemara asks, but is an animal that is forewarned with regard to animals considered forewarned with regard to people as well? Certainly it is not. So rather, Rav Shimi said, the Mishnah is discussing a case where it killed 3 Gentiles, for which the animal is not put to death. And the Gemara asks, but is an animal that is forewarned with regard to Gentiles considered forewarned with regard to Jews as well? Rather, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said the Mishnah is discussing a case where it killed 3 people who had wounds that would have caused them to die within 12 months. This is known as a treifa. And since they were on the verge of dying anyway, the ox is not put to death for killing them. Nevertheless, it is rendered forewarned with regard to its future goring and killing of people. Now, bear in mind that, as is so often the case, we're really getting into hypothetical situations. And rest assured that an ox that killed any human would be put down. It might not be put down under this particular law, but it would be put down under a different set of laws. So it's not that, Jews value Jewish life at some other level than they value non-Jewish life. All human lives are equally valuable. We kill our enemies when they're trying to kill us. That's a very different matter. That's war. But this is something different. What we're saying is we're talking about how you attain forewarned status with respect to killing if, as soon as it kills a person, it is put down. So really the possibilities that we've heard so far, the most reasonable is that it injured a person, but that person was recovering or, was had a wound, but was not dead. And that happened 3 times. And then all the people died after the last goring. So that's where you have a situation where the ox has to be put down because it did end up killing people, but where it did not attain that forewarned status. Now the Gemara asks, but is an animal that is forewarned with regard to a treifa? So a treifa, right? So this is the same as the law of treif when we're talking about, cattle that we eat, right? When they're slaughtered properly. And then, one of the things that after it is shechted, after we do kosher slaughter, right, which is a very, very straight, sharp knife cut across the throat, and then the butcher comes in and starts, cutting up the animal and dividing the kosher parts that are okay for eating from the non-kosher parts that are used for other things. And then one of the examinations that's done whenever a kosher animal is slaughtered in a kosher manner is an examination of the lung. And the reason being that sometimes a lung is pierced by some kind of thorn or a needle, and it creates a wound that the animal was walking around and might be fine, but that wound would have caused it to die within a year's time. When somebody has a wound that, for sure is going to cause death within a year, it's like walking dead, right? In other words, it's considered an animal that is going to die by eventually, but it doesn't have to be today or tomorrow, but within a year, and therefore it is not fit for eating, right? It is not fit for eating, and that's called a treifa. And we can apply that same designation to a human that's been wounded, but is not going to die immediately, not by the ox, but if an ox gores a person that's on his way to die already, you might say that ox is not going to be put down. Now, we're not really studying that law right now. I think there's a lot more to it, because that's in terms of the treifa designation. That's why I'm saying there's always laws that overlap with other laws, because it is also a Jewish law. For example, if you have somebody that has a terrible injury, that's in a coma, and is probably, the doctors have said, that person's going to die in a few days. And then somebody comes along and pulls the plug. That's murder. You're not allowed to shorten a person's life, even if, that life is coming to an end very soon. That's not permitted under Jewish law, and is considered murder. Therefore, the concept of treifa, and that the ox wouldn't be put down because, it killed a person who's a treifa, doesn't change the fact that if, a human kills a person, even if they're a treifa, so-called treifa, that person would still be guilty of murder. And here, we're talking about, is the ox put down or not? Is the ox going to achieve forewarned status or not? But it doesn't change the fact that the owner of that ox is going to have a liability issue for sure, because his ox, which is not safeguarded, ended up killing a person, even if they were a treifa. So the Gemara asks, but is an animal that is forewarned with regard to a treifa considered forewarned with regard to an intact person, i.e. one who is not a treifa? So now we're talking about this hypothetical situation where an ox only gored treifas, right? People who are on the verge of death. So the Gemara dismisses that idea. So rather, Rav Papa said, the Mishnah is discussing a case where the ox killed a person and fled to the marsh, and then it killed again and fled to the marsh, and then killed again and fled to the marsh again. It's like a horror movie, right? It's this ox that emerges, out of the foggy marsh, kills a person, and then disappears into the foggy marsh again. So we can't identify the ox and render, and give a warning to its owner. In that situation, the court was not able to kill the ox before it had killed 3 times, rendering it forewarned. So Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika, said, the Mishnah is discussing a case where the witnesses who had rendered the witnesses who testified to the 3 incidents of goring as conspiring witnesses, resulting in the animal not being put to death, were themselves subsequently proven to be conspiring witnesses by other witnesses. So for the animal to be deemed forewarned, right, the witnesses have to come to court and say, that ox that belongs to such and such person gored, this other animal or this person. And then there's 3 instances of that. And maybe the same witnesses saw it every time, or maybe there's 3 sets of witnesses for the 3 different times. And that's what renders the animal muad, a forewarned ox. So whenever there's testimony of witnesses, there's a possibility that those witnesses are lying. So how do we establish that witnesses are lying? Because other witnesses come forward and say, those 2 witnesses were testifying that ox gored, the goat down the street. They couldn't have seen that because we were with those 2 witnesses, on the beach 20 miles away at the time that they're saying they saw Reuven's ox goring Shimon's goat. So they're liars, right? So that is where we have brought witnesses to establish the first set of witnesses as conspiring witnesses. When that happens, then whatever liability would have been assessed as a result of the conspiring witnesses' testimony, the conspiring witnesses themselves, they have to pay that money, right? Because they lied and tried to create liability for a defendant. Now, if the witnesses who established the first set of witnesses as conspiring witnesses are themselves conspiring witnesses, and we prove that because we bring a third set who says no, the people who say that the first witnesses are liars because they were all together at the beach 20 miles away, that new set of witnesses, they're the liars because we were with them inland 50 miles away at the time that they're saying that they were on the beach with the first set of witnesses. And so in that situation, we would restore the original testimony of the first witnesses who said that the ox, did such and such and therefore is a forewarned ox. Now, it might have taken time for all of this to happen. So the ox that should have been forewarned was not established as forewarned until later, and that's how it had time to gore 3 different people and not be put down. It killed 3 different people and not be put down because of the procedural delay in the 2 sets of witnesses. But the Gemara answers, no. You don't have to go to such a complicated story. Rather, how do we establish a forewarned ox with respect to killing people? Why wasn't it put down after it killed the first person? The Gemara says, no, it is with regard to an animal being put to death. I.e., the ox is not killed if it is a victim of circumstances beyond its control. Right? So that was the stadium ox, as an example, where the ox did kill a person, but it was trained to do that. It wasn't a vicious ox that's dangerous to people, or let's say it became a vicious ox, but not, out of its nature. It was trained that way. And either, it was something we have no control over, like the Roman circus, where they took oxen and trained them, to kill people, or some other circumstances that really had nothing to do with the nature of the animal. So too, it is reasonable, as if you say that the ruling of the Baraisa with regard to an animal's eligibility to be brought as an offering. Wait a minute. What am I saying? That was yesterday. Sorry, I didn't turn the page. That was the conspiring witnesses. So consequently, the testimonies of the witnesses who testified about the incidents of goring were reinstated, rendering the ox forewarned. Sorry, now I turned the page. So the Gemara asks, this explanation works out well if it is assumed that the purpose of testifying to the ox's goring is because we wish to establish the ox as forewarned. Once the testimony concerning the incidents of goring is reinstated, it is established that the ox gored 3 times. But if we wish to warn the man who owns the ox by testifying that the animal gored, he could say to the judge, after it is established that his ox was forewarned, hey, I didn't know that my ox was forewarned, since the witnesses had previously been rendered conspiring witnesses. And the Gemara answers, well, no, actually what we're talking about is a case where the witnesses say each time his ox killed a person, he, the owner, was standing next to it, so that he cannot claim ignorance that his ox is a habitually goring ox. So Ravina said the Mishna is discussing a case where the witnesses recognized the owner of the ox, but did not recognize the ox itself. Therefore, with regard to the first incidents of goring, they testified that it was his ox that gored, but they did not testify with regard to which of his oxen it was. And that is why the ox was not put to death. Only afterward did they realize that this was the same ox that had gored 3 times. So the Gemara asks, if so, why is the ox rendered forewarned? What could the owner have done to prevent it from goring again, as he did not know which of his oxen had gored? And the Gemara answers that it is rendered forewarned because the court effectively said to him, you have a habitually goring ox in your herd, so you must safeguard your entire herd. If we know that it's one of your oxen has killed 3 people, and you don't know which, and we don't know which, okay, well then it's on you to make sure that none of your oxen escape and can hurt people again. And that is the law. Now, the Mishnah teaches And both this forewarned ox and that innocuous ox are liable to be put to death because they killed a person, unless it was, like the stadium ox, circumstances beyond its control. So the sages taught, we learn by inference from that which is stated with regard to an ox that killed a person. And if an ox gores a man or a woman that they die, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be clear. Exodus 21:28. Now, don't I know from this verse that the stoning makes it an unslaughtered animal carcass, right? It was not the subject of a kosher slaughter. Jews cannot eat meat. First of all, the only meat we can eat comes from an animal that's a kosher animal, right? A camel is not kosher. A cow is kosher. A pig is not kosher. A goat is kosher. A sheep is kosher. So you have to start with a kosher animal, and then it has to be slaughtered in a kosher manner, as I mentioned earlier, with a very sharp blade across the neck. So Jews cannot eat animals that were hunted, right, that were killed with a bullet, because that animal was not kosher slaughtered, shechted. That's the word for it, right? A kosher slaughterer is a shochet. And the verb for kosher slaughter is shecht, right? So an animal has to be shechted for it to be permissible for a Jew to eat it. So if it didn't die via kosher slaughter, it's not kosher. We can't eat it. So what the Gemara is saying is, if the animal was stoned to death, why does the Torah have to tell us that we can't eat it? We know we can't eat it because it wasn't shechted. So what is the meaning when the verse states its flesh shall not be eaten? The verse is telling you that even if one shechted the ox after its verdict had been reached, but before it was executed via stoning, it is still prohibited to eat it. Because it killed a person. I have derived only that one is prohibited to eat it. From where is it derived that one is prohibited from deriving benefit from the ox as well? The verse states, but the owner of the ox shall be clear. You might have thought that means that once the ox is stoned, he doesn't have any more responsibility. But that's not what that phrase means. The Gemara asks, what is the inference? How is this law derived from the statement that the owner shall be clear? And Shimon ben Zoma says, this is like a person who says to his friend, so-and-so was left clear of his property and has no benefit from it at all. Similarly, but the owner of the ox shall be clear means he may not derive benefit from the ox at all. You can't eat it, you can't sell it, you can't sell its hide, you can't use it for anything. So the Gemara asks, and from where is it known that this phrase, its flesh shall not be eaten, serves to teach a law with regard to a case where he slaughtered the ox after its verdict was reached, but before it was stoned, and is teaching that one is prohibited to eat it? Why not say that it is permitted to eat the ox if he slaughtered it after its verdict had been reached? And this phrase, its flesh shall not be eaten, serves to teach a law with regard to a case where they had already stoned it, but not to teach a prohibition against eating it, as that is already known due to the fact that it was stoned. Rather, it serves to prohibit deriving benefit from the ox, and that would be in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Abahu. In other words, this phrase, it shall not be eaten, that's the phrase that teaches us you can't get any benefit from it, since we know it can't be eaten once it's stoned. So Rabbi Abahu says that Rabbi Elazar says that wherever it is stated, it shall not be eaten, or you, singular, you one person as opposed to you plural, but you singular shall not eat, or you plural, all of you shall not eat, both a prohibition against eating and a prohibition against deriving benefit are indicated. And this is so unless the verse specifies for you that one may derive benefit in the manner that it's specified for you with regard to an animal carcass, from which the verse explicitly permits one to derive benefit. Right? So normally, an ox dies on your ranch. It's not because it, killed someone and then was stoned and put down and executed, but rather maybe a mountain lion came and attacked it and took a few bites and left the carcass. So you can't eat that animal because it wasn't shechted, but you are permitted to derive benefit from it. You can cut it up You can give it to Gentiles. They don't have this law about kosher meat. They can eat animals that weren't shechted. They can eat the produce of hunting. Or you could feed it to your animals, right? You have dogs on your ranch. You have other animals that are carnivores that would eat that meat. You're free to give it to them. You can derive benefit from a carcass, a nevela, right? An animal that died not by means of shechting. You just can't eat it. So the Gemara continues, and this is, so in other words, unless the Torah says that you may derive benefit from it, if the Torah says you shall not eat it, the prohibition on benefit is included in the prohibition on eating, right? Unless the Torah specifically says it is permitted for benefit. That's what Rabbi Bava is saying. So the Gemara continues, and this is so unless the verse specifies for you that one may derive benefit in the manner that it's specified to you with regard to the animal carcass, from which the verse explicitly permits one to derive benefit, as it states, you may sell it to a foreigner. Accordingly, it is permitted to transfer an unslaughtered animal carcass, a nevela, to a ger toshav, the resident alien, the non-Jew who lives in the Holy Land alongside of you. And here it's defined, perfect, right? In Rabbi Steinsaltz's elucidation, the ger toshav, i.e., a Gentile who resides in the land of Israel and observes the 7 Noahide laws, right? That's the ger toshav. That's for another day, as I've mentioned before, which I think is important. Who is permitted to live in Israel when the Jews have sovereignty in Israel? Who's permitted to live there alongside the Jews, right? So first of all, it's somebody who wants to live alongside the Jews, like, for example, Israeli Arabs and the Druze and all the non-Jews who live in Israel, and there's many of them, who are content to live there and are not trying to destroy Israel and eradicate the Jews. So they desire to live there, and they accept upon themselves the 7 Noahide laws. When you talk about Hamas and the vile, evil leadership, that it's a bunch of terrorists who, you should free the Gazan people from Hamas, right, who sacrificed them as human shields, and Hamas violates every one of the 7 Noahide laws. Obviously, that's a talk for another day. Okay, so at any rate, you can give the nevela, the unslaughtered carcass, to the ger toshav, and you can give it to him as a gift, and you can give it to any other Gentile through selling it to him. Oh, interesting. You can't sell it to the ger toshav. You can only give it to him as a gift, but other Gentiles who live outside the land, you can sell it to them. So interesting. The ger toshav, right? So the resident alien, what you can see, he's been elevated, right? He's got an elevated status, and that's why you can't sell it to him, just like you couldn't sell it to another Jew. So apparently, without this explicit permission, it would be prohibited to derive any benefit from a carcass due to the prohibition, you shall not eat it. So here too, with regard to the ox that is stoned, the phrase, its flesh shall not be eaten, may serve to teach you both that it shall not be eaten and that you may not benefit from it. So if that's true, what does you shall be clear of it teach, right? That's the next question. So the sages said in response, the statement applies where both the prohibition of eating and the prohibition of deriving benefit are derived from a verse using an expression such as, it shall not be eaten. But here, where the prohibition of eating is derived from the statement, the ox shall be stoned, since you know it's stoned and not shechted, if it enters your mind that the expression, its flesh shall not be eaten, is stated only in reference to the prohibition of deriving benefit, then let the merciful one write explicitly, benefit shall not be derived from it. Alternatively, let the verse simply state, it shall not be eaten. Why do I require the specific term, its flesh? Clearly, the intention of the verse is to teach that even if he has rendered it like kosher flesh by properly slaughtering it after the verdict, one is still prohibited to eat it because it killed a person. Now, Mar Zutra objects to this. Say that this statement applies, now we're on page 41b, say that this statement applies only in a case where he checked a sharp piece of flint and seeing that it did not have any defects, he slaughtered the ox with it. In that case, one could say that by slaughtering it with a stone, he performed the equivalent to stoning. Therefore, it is prohibited to eat it. But in a case where he slaughtered it with a knife made of metal, one is not prohibited from eating it. False, right? False. That is not the law, which is very interesting, that a blade that you would use to shecht an animal so that it's a kosher slaughter and a Jew could eat it does not have to be made out of metal. What it does have to be is a perfectly smooth, it can be curved a little bit, but it has to be a perfectly smooth and regular edge and very, very sharp so that it can make, the sort of perfect, quick cut that kosher slaughter requires. So you can have a knife made out of flint, for example, or obsidian. It could be made out of glass. It does not have to be made out of metal. Why do you normally use metal? Because it's easier to put a very sharp edge on it and to ensure that it is smooth and it remains smooth. Because if you're using, let's say, a flint or an obsidian knife, a stone knife, and you shecht with it, and then you discover that the blade has a nick in it, so it's not perfectly smooth, so that would render the slaughter invalid, right? And then it would be an unkosher animal, and you would not be permitted to eat it. So, to avoid that, it could be a big loss, right? When you're talking about the value of a cow, I mean, that's many thousands of dollars. And so that's why the kosher, the shochet is going to be very careful about his blades, making sure that it's smooth and always checking it right before he slaughters to ensure that it is smooth. But the point being, even if you used a knife made out of stone, if it had a proper edge on it, it would be a kosher slaughter, and we would not say that since you killed it with a stone knife that it was not shechted and instead it was stoned. No, it was a kosher slaughter as long as the knife remained smooth. And the sages said in response, is that to say that it is written in the Torah that slaughter must be performed specifically with a knife, which would justify a distinction between slaughtering with a stone and a metal knife? But didn't we learn in a Mishna in Tractate Chulin 15b with regard to one who slaughters with a hand sickle, or with a piece of flint, or even with a reed, right? You could make it out of organic matter if you could get a smooth enough edge on it. If these implements were suitable to be used for slaughter, his slaughter is valid. And the Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Bahu, now that he derives the prohibition of eating and the prohibition of deriving benefit from the same clause, its flesh shall not be eaten, then according to so the sages disagree with him. They said, no. We learn it shall not be eaten from the fact that it was stoned, and we learn that there is no benefit possible from the owner shall be clear, and we learn from it shall not be eaten that even if you slaughtered it in a kosher slaughter after the verdict but before it was stoned, you still cannot eat it. That's how the majority interpret. Since Rabbi Bahu says you can learn no benefit as well as no eating from the same it shall not be eaten, then what does Rabbi Bahu do with the phrase the owner shall be clear? Right? And according to Rabbi Bahu, now that he derives the prohibition of eating, the prohibition of deriving benefit from the verse, its flesh shall not be eaten, why do I require this statement, the owner of the ox shall be clear? And the Gemara answers, this is stated to prohibit deriving benefit from its hide after it has been killed, as it could enter your mind to say that it is specifically its flesh from which it is prohibited to derive benefit, as the verse states, its flesh shall not be eaten. But deriving benefit from its hide might be permitted. Therefore, the Torah teaches us that the owner of the ox shall be clear to indicate it is prohibited to derive benefit from any part of the ox. So then the Gemara asks, and according to those sages who expound the verse, the owner of the ox shall be clear, for another interpretation, as we wish to state below, from where do they derive this prohibition against deriving benefit from the ox's hide? And the Gemara answers, they derive it from the wording, its flesh shall not be eaten, velo yachel es besaro. And the verse could have been formulated, velo yachel besaro, which already means, and its flesh shall not be eaten. The addition of the word es, or et, depending on how you pronounce it, teaches that the prohibition applies also to that which is secondary to the flesh. And what is that? That is its hide. And the Gemara adds, and this Tana, this sage, who derives it from the statement, the owner of its ox shall be clear, does not interpret the word et as a means to derive new laws. He considers the word et to be an ordinary part of the sentence structure and not a source for exegetical exposition. Right? We've seen this idea several times before in our journey through the Talmud, that it's just a feature of Hebrew that where there's a subject, a verb, and a direct object, often the syntax of the Hebrew requires this connector word, et, to be there, and it doesn't really change the meaning. It's just a syntactical need of the Hebrew language. So some of the sages say, nothing is extra in the Torah, so we can derive some kind of a meaning from the presence of that word there. And other sages say, the word is necessary for the grammar, so we don't have necessarily the right to interpret another law from it. And we see this dispute, we've seen it before, now here it is recapitulated, as it is stated in the Baraisa, Shimon ha-Amasoni, and some say that it was Nehemiah ha-Amasoni, would interpret all occurrences of the word et in the Torah, deriving additional laws with regard to the particular subject matter. Once he reached the verse, you shall fear the Lord your God. Hold on. It's in the Aramaic. But the point is that in the Hebrew, it says, you shall fear the Lord your God, right? You is the subject, fear is the verb, the direct object is God, right? And so there is the word et between the verb and the direct object, which in this case is God. So in the phrase, you shall fear the Lord your God, there is this word et, which is included, that word is included. So when he reached this verse, this Nehemiah ha-Amasoni withdrew from this method of exposition as whose fear could be an extension of the fear of God. There's nowhere further to go. Or you fear God. There's nothing else to be said about that. It's not that you're going to fear someone else from the teaching you shall fear, or you shall have awe of the Lord your God. So there was no way to, make the law bigger. And so then he thought, perhaps I've been wrong to find meaning and interpolation of meaning through this use of the word et in other places in the Torah. So he stopped doing it. And his students said to him, our teacher, what will be with all the occurrences of the word et that you interpreted until now? And he said to them, just as I receive reward for the exposition of those words, so I received reward for my withdrawal from using this method of exposition. It made sense until now. Now it doesn't make sense. So the word et in this verse was not explained until Rabbi Akiva came and expounded. You shall fear the Lord your God. The word et serves to include Torah scholars, i.e. that one is commanded to fear them just as one fears God. In any event, Shimon ha-Amasoni no longer derived additional laws from the word et. Was Rabbi Akiva saying that Torah scholars should be worshipped the way God is worshipped? Obviously not. He wasn't saying anything like that. But what he was saying is that you have to have awe of the people who are communicating God's law to you. And I don't know that this is the direct sort of justification. We'll learn more about it. But, every night we're lighting Hanukkah candles. And when we make the blessing over the Hanukkah candles, we say, blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments, and commanded us commanded us to kindle the lights of Hanukkah. Okay, well, when the Torah was written, there was no Hanukkah. There was Sukkot, there was Pesach, there was Shavuos, the Torah festivals, right, that are explicitly written in the written Torah. But to light candles for Hanukkah, how can we say that God commanded us to do that when God's commandments are in the written Torah? And the answer is because the sages commanded us to light the candles for Hanukkah using the authority that God bestowed upon them. Where it says elsewhere in the Torah, that you shall listen to the elders in your generation to, help you understand what the laws in the Torah are, right? And as we read every day during Hanukkah, that after the miracle of Hanukkah, when the many were delivered into the hands of the few, the impure were delivered into the hands of the pure, the wicked were delivered into the hands of the righteous. Our sages established these 8 days of Hanukkah, as a holy remembrance when we light these lights. And that's why when we light the lights, we say the blessing that God commanded us to do that, because God commanded us through his servants, the sages who established such laws. Now, that doesn't happen anymore. That was the last time that these kinds of commandments were added to the tradition. So it's not that our elders willy-nilly are adding laws in every generation, but it's worth mentioning. Okay, where am I? So the sages taught with regard to the verse, but the owner of the ox shall be clear, that Rabbi Eliezer says it means that he shall be clear from paying half a ransom. Although the owner of an innocuous ox that causes damage is liable to pay half the cost of the damage, if an ox kills a person, its owner is not liable to pay the ransom. Right? The owner didn't do anything negligent because he had an innocuous ox. He didn't know that his ox posed a danger to people and that it might kill. Hadn't done anything like that before. And so as an innocuous ox, he's going to have to pay for half the damage that it did, but he's not going to be liable to pay for the ransom, right? The atonement. Rabbi Kiva said to him, I guess to Rabbi Eliezer, why is it necessary for the verse to teach this? But isn't compensation for damage caused by an innocuous ox itself anyway paid only from the value of its body? So here too, its owner can say to the claimant, bring it to court and it will pay you, i.e. you will be paid from its value. Since the ox is stoned, there is nothing from which he can receive payment. Therefore, according to your interpretation, the verse does not introduce any new law that could not have been inferred by logic, and it is therefore superfluous. Rabbi Eliezer said to Rabbi Akiva, is this how I appear in your eyes? That my derivation from the verse is in reference to this case, that of an ox that is liable to be put to death? Obviously, no verse would be required to teach this law in such a case. My derivation is only with regard to a case where the assumption that the ox killed a person is based on the testimony of one witness, or is based on the admission of the owner. Such proof is not sufficient for the ox to be put to death by stoning. But one might have thought that it is sufficient to require its owner to pay ransom. And the Gemara asks, if it is based on the admission of the owner, he clearly would not be liable to pay ransom, since he would be admitting to an act that results in a fine, in which case a person is exempt from paying the fine. So why would it be necessary for the verse to state this exemption? Again, we have this rule that one who admits is not, he admits to it, he's exempt from a fine. He's going to have to pay damages. A fine is different than restitution. Right? A fine is a penalty. And one who admits to what would cause the fine to be paid doesn't have to pay the fine. And it actually makes sense because to force someone to pay a fine, you bring witnesses, right? If a person admits it, well, you can't testify against yourself. You are not considered a witness against yourself. You can confess, right? You can admit that you did something, and it will definitely have repercussions, but it won't result in the same result as when two witnesses pin you down and then we ascribe a fine. There'll be other kinds of damages, but not the fine. So the Gemara, I'm sorry, what did I say? One might have thought. Right, okay. So the Gemara asks, if it is based on the admission of the owner... Right, okay. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Eliezer holds that ransom is for the purpose of atonement and is not considered a fine. Accordingly, one might have assumed that even in a case where there is not conclusive testimony, the owner must pay ransom to atone for the killing. Therefore, the verse states that in the case of an innocuous ox, the owner is not liable to pay half a ransom. Now, it is taught in another baraisa that Rabbi Eliezer said to him, Akiva, is this how I appear in your eyes, that my derivation from the verse is in reference to this case, that of an ox that is liable to be put to death? No, my derivation is only with regard to a case where the ox intended to kill an animal, but killed a person instead. Or where it intended to kill a non-Jew, but it killed a Jew. Or where it intended to kill a non-viable baby, but killed a viable person. An ox is not put to death if it intended to gore in a manner which would not render it liable to be put to death, even if it did gore in such a manner. In such a case, the owner of the ox must pay ransom. Therefore, the verse states that if it is an innocuous ox, the owner is exempt from paying half a ransom. Now, these two barises cite different responses that Rabbi Eliezer gave Rabbi Akiva. So which one of these explanations did he say to him first? And Rav Kahana said in the name of Rava, he first said to him the explanation referring to the ox's intention to kill someone for which it would not be liable to put to death, and subsequently gave him the second explanation with regard to the testimony of a single witness or of the owner's admission. And Rav Tavyume said in the name of Rava, he first said to him the explanation that is a case where the assumption that the ox killed was based on one witness or its owner's admission, and then the other explanation. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. So the Gemara explains the reasoning behind the two opinions. Rav Kahana said in the name of Rava that first he said to him the explanation involving the ox's intention, since this opinion is preferable to the other one, against which a difficulty was raised earlier. And this is analogous to a fisherman pulling fish from the sea. When he finds big ones, he takes them. And when he finds small ones, he takes them as well. Here too, although Rabbi Eliezer's first explanation was sufficient, he added an additional response, despite the fact that it was not as good as the first. By contrast, Rav Tavyume said in the name of Rava that Rabbi Eliezer first said to Rabbi Akiva the explanation involving inconclusive testimony, asserting that the ox killed, since this is analogous to a fisherman pulling fish from the sea, who finds small ones and takes them, and then when he finds big ones, he tosses the small ones back, and he only keeps the big ones. Here too, Rabbi Eliezer thought of a better response to Rabbi Akiva's question. He suggested it instead of the first. That's what I've got for us tonight. Okay, 3 questions. Joe, you have stated that Jews do not castrate animals. Are they also prohibited from dehorning cattle and goats? Great question. To my knowledge, there is no such prohibition. Jonathan, yes, et is a connector word. In Kabbalah, et equals the Shekhinah, at least partially, since it has the first and last letter, Aleph and Tav, the first and last letters of the alphabet, and therefore it equals God's full dominion, Malchus. Right, so what Jonathan is saying is that there's a spiritual interpretation where this word et, composed of the first and last letter of the alphabet, implies the presence of God always in the world, whether we see it or not. Beautiful, thank you. And finally, Marjorie, citing the hound of the Baskervilles, the ox of the foggy marsh. It works. Very good. Seriously, I think the fact that the sages, old and new, are willing to question and debate all this minutiae in the law makes both understanding and belief in the Word of God stronger in everyone who studies. Amen. Thank you, Marjorie. Beautifully put. That's what I've got for us tonight. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Thursday, at the same time as today, 5 p.m. Pacific. That's just today and tomorrow. Not a permanent thing. But tomorrow again at 5 p.m. Pacific, 1 hour earlier than usual. Have a great night.